The light of evening London shimmered in puddles, mixing with the reflections of advertising on glass facades. The rain beat rhythmically, like a metronome, as if time itself was trying to lull the city. The streets were filled with cold, and the air was filled with a silence that was so lacking during the day. After 13 hours on the set, Cillian Murphy, exhausted, turned down the collar of his coat and disappeared into the depths of the Angel Tube station. That he did not attract attention, he had none of the charisma that filled the screens. In his everyday coat, with a slight tired tilt in his posture, he seemed part of the surrounding landscape. That was how he liked to be, inconspicuous. People hurried to the trains, swallowing the remains of the working day in takeaway coffee. Everything breathed of ordinariness. Cillian sat in the penultimate carriage, a place where there are usually fewer people. His fingers, still a little damp from the rain, touched the cold metal handrail. The train moved. His eyes slowly closed, but he had a habit of not sleeping in the subway. Not because of fear. It just always seemed to him that it was here in this silence between stations that the world spoke to a person most honestly. There were 5 passengers in his compartment. Near the door was an elderly couple, holding hands like schoolchildren. Opposite was a man in a business suit, rereading the same line on his phone screen for the 3rd time. And closer to Cillian was a young woman, about 25, with a large scarf and a slightly too big belly. She was pregnant. Her face was pale, her movements were disheveled. She looked lonely, although she tried to keep herself restrained. When the train entered the tunnel between stations, everything suddenly changed. The light went out. Sharply. Suddenly. The metal beneath his feet trembled, as if the air had held its breath. Then a complete stop. People looked at each other with anxiety, but not yet panic. Someone laughed uncertainly, probably a technical delay. That minute dragged on longer than it could. The silence turned into something dense, rusty. The train did not move. The emergency lights barely flickered in the darkness. Cillian slowly stood up, not out of panic, but out of that intuitive need to understand if everything was okay. And it was at that moment, through the faint noise, that he heard, not words. The sound that broke his vigilance: a short, sharp breath. Another one. And then an attempt to say something, but his voice broke. It was the same young woman. She pressed her hands to her stomach, her breathing became more frequent. "Are you okay?" Cillian asked quietly, leaning closer. She nodded, but her eyes betrayed something else: fear. Deep, primal. They remained in the dark carriage, in the middle of the city that never sleeps. But in this darkness a new voice was emerging, one that demanded not a role, but a real presence. No one yet knew that this night he would play a role for which he had not prepared. Not according to the script. Not on the set. But in reality, where he least wanted to be a hero, the carriage breathed a silence that could have been cut with a knife. Cillian could feel the air filling with anxiety. There was no movement, not a click, not a sound from the speakers. It was as if the tunnel itself had decided to lock everyone in. At that moment, the pregnant woman slowly moved closer to the wall and tried to take a deep breath, but instead of peace, she heard a short, strangled moan. I think something is starting." Her voice trembled. It's too soon." Cillian leaned toward her. "What's your name?" "Sarah." "Okay, Sarah. I'm with you. I'm not a doctor, but we'll figure it out, okay?" Her eyes darted around in the darkness, searching for a point of support. These words, simple, calm, spoken in complete darkness by a strange man gave her at least a drop of stability. Cillian turned to the other passengers. There were 5 of them this time. They weren't hiding behind their phone screens. Someone tried to call, but there was no signal. The older man of the couple carried a flashlight, small but enough to illuminate the area around him. She's pregnant. She's in pain. She might be going into labor, Cillian said calmly but firmly. Is anyone here a doctor? There was no answer. But the very question woke them up. The businessman, who had been silent until now, took off his jacket and held it out. Use it as a pillow. The light flickered, and every movement was a fragment of silent compassion. Sarah clenched her hands, trying to hold herself together. She had no one to share this fear with, no one around her, until she met him. Cillian stood beside her, holding her shoulder. His palm strong, quiet, determined, seemed to be studying her anxiety by touch. Breathe with me. Like this, slowly. Let's count to 4, and exhale. He didn't know where all this came from in him. Maybe from the movies he'd acted in, maybe from his own pain, which had taught him to listen to silence. But now something else was speaking in him, responsibility. The minutes dragged on like hours. The train remained in place. It seemed that the tunnel was deeper than time. No one explained what had happened. In the air was the scent of metal, of dusty old iron. And suddenly, a child's quiet voice in the next compartment, "Dad, why is everyone silent?" These words split the space. And immediately another loud moan from Sarah. She curled up like a shell, hugging her stomach. Her face was pale, with beads of sweat that the flashlight caught with ruthless clarity. Cillian, she barely managed to say, "It's begun. It's definitely begun." The noise in his head seemed to have stopped. Everything superfluous had disappeared. There was only her breathing, and her heartbeat, his, strange, audible in the fingers holding her hand. "Okay, Sarah. You're not alone. We'll do everything we can." He looked at the passengers. "We need warm things. Scarves, jackets, anything. We'll make space for her. She needs to lie down. We're her team, do you hear?" No one laughed. No one asked who he was. Because now, in this darkness, he was the one who shone. The light didn't return. Time lost its contours. Sarah lay pressed against the folded coats, her body trembling. Cillian was beside her, a damp handkerchief cooling her forehead. He did not leave. Even when someone whispered softly, "He's an actor, isn't he?" he remained calm, almost transparent. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered between contractions. That he did not answer immediately. Because no one should be alone in the dark. The air in the train car was warm now, not from comfort, but from closeness, human breath, and trembling hearts. The emergency lights overhead flickered as if gasping for strength. Somewhere far beyond the concrete shell around them, the city lived on in its rhythms. But here, in the gut of the tunnel, time had stopped obeying. Cillian had lost count of the minutes. The walls around him, the faces dimly lit and full of quiet fear, were becoming part of a tableau he knew he'd carry for the rest of his life. He was no longer an actor. He was a man holding the fragile thread of another person's life in the palms of his hands. Sarah's breathing was uneven now, more erratic, as each wave of pain claimed more of her focus. Her body had given up pretending it was too early. The reality of labor had made itself undeniable. Still, she tried to smile between contractions, as though humor could carry her through this storm. "You're calm," she whispered, after one particularly harsh spasm passed. "Were you always like this?" Cillian met her gaze. Sweat-dampened strands of her hair stuck to her forehead, and her lips trembled from exhaustion. "Not always," he said softly. "There were years when I ran from everything. Fame, people, noise. But tonight, I'm here. And I'm not running." That he squeezed her hand again, grounding her. His own hand smelled faintly of iron and wool and something unnameable like the weight of responsibility. A faint noise crackled overhead. The static from the train's loudspeaker sputtered, then faded again into silence. Cillian instinctively stood up, balancing against the sudden sway of the halted train. That he turned to the older couple. "Sir, can you check if there's any emergency phone in the next car? Maybe someone's heard something. Any signal, a call, anything." The man nodded without hesitation. People who had once sat like strangers were now silent comrades, unified by uncertainty. The businessman, still clutching his flashlight, aimed its soft beam at the floor as he shifted closer. "I think I heard voices," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Faint. That way. There might be responders on the other side of the tunnel wall." Cillian leaned in, ears straining against the thickened silence. And yes, there it was. A murmur. Muffled, distant. Someone was out there. He glanced at Sarah, then back at the man. "Keep the light steady on her. Talk to her. Keep her awake." Without another word, he opened the carriage door slowly, stepping into the pitch-dark connection between train cars. The metallic floor shuddered faintly beneath him, echoing his movement. It felt like walking through breath itself, dense, urgent, unseen. He moved one car down. Then another. The sounds were clearer now, men's voices, urgent, professional. His heart leapt. "Hello," he shouted, hitting the window. "There's a woman here. She's in labor. We need help now." A flashlight beam caught his eyes. Relief surged as one of the rescuers signaled back. "We're on it. Hold tight, we're almost in." The voice was clear. Hope had found its crack in the tunnel wall. Cillian turned and ran back, weaving between seats, back through the train. The passengers looked up as he returned, face lit with a new kind of light. "They're here," he said. "Help is coming. We're not alone." But something had changed in Sarah. Her face had gone pale again, and she was biting her lip, holding back another scream. Her eyes locked with Cillian's, wide and scared. "I don't think I can wait," she gasped. "I feel pressure. It's happening now." His breath caught. Around them, the others froze. A decision had to be made right there, right then. Cillian knelt beside her, took off his coat and laid it beneath her back, folding it with as much gentleness as he could summon. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't trained for this. But she was looking at him like he was the only one she trusted in the world. "Sarah. You've got me. I promise you we're going to do this together." She reached for his hand. Her grip was iron. Outside, the first responder team was entering the tunnel, but in here life was already making its own entrance. It began with a cry, not a newborn's, not yet, but Sarah's. Short, raw, pulled from a place deeper than fear. The kind of sound that suspends the world, that peels the silence away like paint. Cillian didn't flinch. He was kneeling now, one knee on the cold metal floor, one hand bracing Sarah's back as her body arched and convulsed with the rhythm of labor. The train car with its peeling advertisements, dull orange seats, and smeared windows had become something sacred. A cradle suspended in stillness. Sweat dotted his brow. His sleeves were rolled up, his coat folded beneath her, now soaked with both water and fear. The businessman held the flashlight steady near Sarah's knees, averting his eyes respectfully but following Cillian's instructions. The older woman gently wiped Sarah's face with a scarf, whispering softly in a voice that trembled from her own memories. "You're doing great, love. He's right here. He's with you. Just like I was with my daughter. You've got this." Sarah, teeth clenched, gave a weak laugh between moans. "You all act like you do this every day." "Just another Tuesday in London," Cillian murmured, trying to keep his voice steady. It worked. She smiled, briefly, her lips cracking but her eyes clearer, but then another wave came. She screamed this time, long and broken. Cillian's hand wrapped around hers, anchoring her like a knot in a sailcloth during a storm. The train rocked faintly. Somewhere beyond the windows, the flicker of moving lights told them the emergency team was getting closer. But there wasn't time. The child had already decided. It would be now. "I see the head," Cillian said, his voice tightening, but steady. Sarah's eyes widened. "You do?" "Yes. Just one more push, Sarah." "One more." She closed her eyes. Her body surged, her hands crushed his fingers, and then there it was. The room exhaled. In his hands, slippery, tiny, impossibly real, was life. A baby. Blue-faced and still for a breathless second until the sharp, delicate cry pierced the stale air. A cry that filled the car with something no one expected, silence from the others, and then weeping. Not just Sarah's, someone else. The older man, perhaps. Or the young couple in the next car, hearing new life enter their weary world. Cillian's throat was tight. He wrapped the baby in a sweater someone had passed him, trembling slightly as he placed the infant on Sarah's chest. "It's a boy," he whispered. She sobbed. Her arms wrapped around the child, her heart beating against his. "Thank you," she gasped. "Oh God. Thank you." Cillian didn't speak. He just sat beside her, watching. Watching the curve of the baby's tiny mouth, the quiver of breath, the pulse in Sarah's throat as her body settled into its new rhythm. Then a flashlight beamed through the door. The responders had arrived. They rushed in, voices professional but wide-eyed. Cillian stood up slowly, his hands smeared with birth, with miracle. He stepped back as medics surrounded her. One of them stopped, recognizing him. "Wait, are you?" But he raised a hand, gently. No words. He looked down at Sarah, who met his eyes again. "You're going with them now. They'll take care of you." She nodded, barely able to form words, but her hand reached out and he took it again, one last time. "He was born between stations," she said. "That's poetic, isn't it?" Cillian blinked, surprised by how hard that line hit him. He swallowed. "It is," he said. As the medics wheeled her away, she looked back once. "I want to name him after someone. Someone who stayed when I needed it most." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The train was cleared. The other passengers slowly made their way out, some in tears, some smiling. A strange hush followed them. Cillian walked alone down the dark tunnel, his sleeves still rolled, his fingers still tingling. Somewhere far above, cameras were probably rolling again, awards being handed out, scripts waiting in polished leather folders, but none of it felt as real as what he just held. He had brought someone into the world, and he would never be the same. The day was unremarkable. London, grey as always, was folded under layers of fog and bus exhaust. The city had entered its early spring routine, daffodils forcing themselves through concrete planters, pigeons half-heartedly fighting over sandwich crusts, children bundled in jackets they were ready to outgrow. Cillian Murphy sat alone on a park bench in Primrose Hill, his hood up, a paperback in hand, though he hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. That it had been exactly 1 year. He knew the date, though no one else did. No headlines marked the anniversary, no camera crews retraced steps into the tunnel beneath Angel Station. There were no articles titled, "Actor Saves Pregnant Stranger, 1 Year Later." And that was how he wanted it. The event lived only in memory, unfilmed, unspoken, untouched by lights and edits, and yet, it lived. Cillian shifted slightly on the bench. In the distance, children laughed. Parents followed behind with half-empty coffee cups and weary smiles. Spring had an odd way of being subtle and loud at once. Then he saw her. She walked with a careful, rhythmic pace, a young woman in a light coat, scarf fluttering in the breeze. At first, it was the gait that struck him. Familiar, steady, but with a softness that seemed carved from recovery, and in her arms a baby boy, his breath caught. She turned slightly, adjusting the small blanket. The child was nestled against her chest, cheeks pink, eyes alert. And then a glance in his direction. Their eyes met. Sarah, there was no mistaking her. For a moment, she froze mid-step. Her mouth parted in shock, then softened into a slow, almost disbelieving smile. She turned to the boy, whispered something, and made her way toward him. "I wasn't sure it was you," she said. Cillian stood. His voice caught in his throat before he found it again. "That I wasn't sure you'd remember," she laughed quietly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Remember? I relive that night in fragments every day. But some moments, they come back whole. You, holding him. Saying, 'One more push, Sarah.' Like you knew what you were doing." That he smiled modestly, eyes dipping to the child. The boy, wide-eyed and curious, looked back up at him, then offered a toothless grin. "He looks strong," Cillian said. "He is. Stronger than I ever imagined." She shifted, then took a breath. "I named him after you. I wanted to tell you, but I didn't know how to reach you. And maybe I didn't want to invade your world." Cillian's eyes flicked up, startled. "You named him Cillian?" "Yes. Not because you're famous. But because you stayed. Because when I was most afraid, you looked at me like I was more than just another stranger in distress." That he was silent for a moment. The weight of it, of being part of someone's name, of someone's origin, felt heavier than any award he'd ever held. "Thank you," he said finally. "That's... I don't think I have words." Sarah nodded. She sat beside him, the baby in her arms now drifting to sleep, his small body rising and falling gently. "I still ride the tube, you know," she said. "Same line. Same time of day. It scared me for months. But I realized that night wasn't just fear. It was strength. It was strangers turning into something more." Cillian watched the trees move with the wind. "That I think of it too. That night taught me, not who I was pretending to be, but who I could be when no one was watching." They sat in silence for a while. People passed by. The city pulsed on, and then, as Sarah stood to leave, she turned one last time. "That he likes books, you know. You should read to him someday." Cillian's brow lifted. "I'd like that," she nodded. The boy stirred, opened his eyes, and looked straight at him, a look not of recognition, but of something pure. Unfiltered presence, and in that moment, something inside Cillian shifted. That it was subtle, but permanent. Spring gave way to summer, as it always did, not with fireworks, but in unnoticed ways. A little more warmth in the evening breeze. A few more open windows on residential streets. Cillian noticed these things now. Since that day in the park, the chance meeting with Sarah and the boy named after him, he had started noticing a lot. The world felt sharper, less like a blur glimpse through cameras and more like something he could touch. It began with small things that he stopped saying yes to every script that he turned down, a role, a major one that would have brought him back into the heart of Hollywood's noise. It wasn't because it lacked quality, but because, for the first time, he asked himself, do I want to be away that long? And for what? He went walking more, not the kind of fast-paced power walk celebrities do in baseball caps and sunglasses, but real walks, long, aimless ones through streets that didn't care who he was. He liked bookstores with dusty shelves and little cafes with crooked chairs. He didn't feel the need to be seen. He'd done enough of that. More than once, he found himself outside the hospital where Sarah had been taken that night. He never went in. Just stood across the street, hands in his coat pockets, eyes tracing the path of memory. Not out of sorrow but reverence. That night, it had taken something from him, and given something far greater. 6 months later, a letter arrived. It was handwritten, the ink a little smudged, as though the writer had paused too often, or pressed too hard. Dear Cillian, he took his first steps last week. I thought of you when he did. Maybe because it reminded me how we're all just trying to find balance, falling forward, catching ourselves. I don't know what that night gave you. But I know what it gave me. Courage I didn't think I had. And a story I'll tell my son someday. If you ever want to come by even just for tea, you're always welcome. Warmly, Sarah. He read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and tucked it inside a book he kept by his bed, not for reading, but for keeping things that mattered. The next Sunday, he found himself walking toward a quiet street in Kentish Town. He didn't know what he'd say. Maybe nothing. Maybe just hello. Maybe he'd read a story to the boy. Maybe they'd sit in silence and drink tea. It didn't matter. He rang the bell. A moment passed, the door opened, and there he was, little Cillian, barely walking, holding the edge of a couch for support, a wobble in his knees and something fearless in his smile. Sarah's voice floated from the kitchen. Just a minute, the boy waddled forward. He looked up at the man standing in the doorway. No confusion. No hesitation, just recognition, not of a face, but of something older, the memory of safety. Cillian knelt, hands open, and the boy, with surprising certainty, stepped forward and placed a small hand on his. Later that night, as they sat in the kitchen with cups of warm tea, Cillian looked across the table at Sarah. You ever think about how that night could have gone differently? She nodded. All the time. And yet, here we are. Sarah smiled, then glanced toward the small figure asleep on a blanket nearby. That night gave me him. And gave him, you. Cillian was quiet for a long time. Then, I used to think legacy was about work. About being remembered. He looked at the child. Now I think, it's about who you held when it mattered. And whether you stayed. Sarah reached across the table and touched his hand once more. Not in thanks, not in in friendship. In memory. In quiet, eternal recognition. And outside, the city moved on, but somewhere beneath it, between 2 nameless stations, a new story had once begun. Point one that would never truly end.